Hello and welcome to the Bible Hour. Today we're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapter 11. Really the story of Solomon's unfaithfulness to God and how that's growing, especially at the end of his life, and how that lays the seeds for the separation of the kingdom into two parts, the division into north and south, Israel and Judah, and later on to its final destruction. We're going to hear about the things that Solomon has done that makes him like other kings. We'll also be looking at James chapter 3, and I guess that James, what we're looking at there is the whole idea of the need for us to be complete in our salvation, and it really lifts up the idea of sanctification, that even after we become Christians, we continue to struggle with sin, but we are being asked to move forward in a way that is holistic to make us one with God and one with each other. We'll talk about that as we get there. But let's begin with 1 Kings chapter 11 and with a word of prayer. Lord, as we read this story of Solomon's unfaithfulness and of James' call to us to be faithful, we pray that we might reject the ways of the world and turn and commit ourselves more fully and completely to Christ's call. Amen. And now we're looking at 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. So we hear that just as with his father David, he has many different wives, and the implication is that these women, his love for them is taking him away from God. Now some people have suggested this is unfair to those women, that it implies that they're the problem rather than Solomon. I guess I've never read it that way. I've always read that it was Solomon's problem. That's why he went after all these wives, so it was because of a spiritual problem within himself. And that he is listening to their advice and that is taking him and the kingdom away from God. It was certainly true in the ancient world that moral and religious instruction was left largely to the women or mothers, especially for younger children. And that's seemingly why there's more emphasis placed on their role in the family's home. So who the mother is more indicative. In fact, even today in Judaism, your connection to Judaism is driven more by your mother than your father. So if your mother was Jewish, going back a few generations, that's a closer tie to Judaism than your father. Interesting to think of that. I don't know, I hope that's not universally true, although cultures where women do the majority of the child rearing, what's it, the old statement, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. I mean, I think that's indicative of the idea, at least, that those who raise children are shaping tomorrow. And we can argue about how much women do that, but certainly in their culture that would have been more of their primary role. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. So the picture here is a Solomon marrying especially groups that it was forbidden for the Israelites to marry. Now, it's important to hear this. There were only certain groups that the Israelites were forbidden to marry. The idea being their religion posed a danger at specific times or at some point in history. It's not forbidden, period. But it certainly ties in with something we often talk about today in the church. Marrying someone outside the faith can create all kinds of problems within the home. And indeed, it's hard to be married to someone with whom you don't share fundamental values. Right? That in itself is a problem and a difficulty. So here he is really being drawn away by their faith and their beliefs, and leading the nation away is the indication. And he held fast to them in love. One wonders how much he could love 1,000 women that he's married to. I think it must mean that that's where his priorities lie, with them and their beliefs and ideas and this role that he has projected out to himself. He seems to be living, in fact, very similarly to the world. And in fact, one of the things that many commentators point out is how much in contrast Solomon is living, with these words from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 17. This is a warning about what it will be like from Moses, about what it will be like when they get a king. When you enter the land that the Lord your God has given you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. So they had a king, just like all the nations around them. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers, so he has to be one of you. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses. Okay, so he's not supposed to do some of the things he did for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. That's an odd thing to specifically require, but it's interesting to note that Solomon is specifically said to have done that in our last chapter. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back all that way again. And then here's where the part that's relevant to us today. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. So the laying up of too much treasure for himself, the taking on of too many wives for himself, puts a focus on himself, his needs, his indulgences, one could say. And I think that's more where it's coming from. It is described as the wise lead him away, but possessions lead you astray as you have more of them too, really revealing where your heart is, right? Okay, well anyhow, having said that, it says, verse 3, he had 700 wives of royal birth. That's a lot of wives. And 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. Okay, so all this, just the amount of time he'd have to spend with them and the effort and emphasis would be distracting. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. So how is this happening? Well, he apparently indulges them in their worship. He builds shrines for their gods, and we don't know to what extent he worships them or participates in those rituals. But it says here, he followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And I'm not going to go into all the things that they believe, but these were religions of fertility gods, and also ones that on their basest or worst level involved child sacrifice. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. And that, of course, is almost hard for me to read. He did not follow him completely as David his father had done. Well, David his father did not follow God very completely always. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites, and again, fertility and gods. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. So Solomon is himself building shrines to foreign gods and encouraging idolatry within the land of Israel. Now, we live in a very different society where freedom of religion is allowed for everybody, but their society is based, their government, their way of life is based on them as a covenant community with God and with one another. So violating this is really attacking almost the heart of who they are supposed to be as a people. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. And you remember, he came to him when he was very young to offer him wisdom, and he came to him again when he was older to really cement the relationship he had with him and to promise to support him on the throne and that there would always be one on the throne. But also that conditional phrase in there about how it was essential that he continue to follow God with his heart. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. Okay, so he was ordered to, but he did not do that. So even though he saw him twice, had a special revelation from God, he didn't listen. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Okay, that's important for us to hear. The kingdom will be torn away. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So what this says is basically God is keeping his promise to Solomon in the sense that he will continue to reign over the land, but he will not reign over all the tribes. Solomon will have them during his lifetime, but afterwards things will change. And that presages the division of the kingdom into the northern and southern halves. And so we speak of the 10 tribes of Israel. And we speak of Judah in the south. And anybody who does the math realizes we're missing a tribe or two. The Levites, who are kind of lifted in there, are in both, presumably still. Benjamin is kind of halfway in between. Traditionally, Simon has sometimes had that kind of halfway role because he's located down there in the south. And then, of course, Joseph's tribe was split in two because of its size, so Ephrath and Manasseh. So we're going to hear about how this broke down later on. So these are the adversaries that Solomon faced. We don't hear about him fighting them during his lifetime, but they're there and growing in strength, and he does nothing to stop them, and indeed his actions seem to push them towards to seeking opportunities. Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. Now, you may remember when we did the story of David that he fought battles against the Edomites and defeated them in battle. And there were a lot of them who died. Apparently this fellow fled to Egypt. And we're going to see parallels between how he was treated in Egypt and how, we'll read through and then we'll see how the parallels, how they strike us. Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab, the commander of the army, who had gone up to bury the dead, had struck down all the men in Edom. So they had killed many of their opponents when they had fought. Joab and all the Israelites stayed there for 6 months and they destroyed all the men in Edom. Now, clearly that's an exaggeration, but they defeated them badly. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then, taking men from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. All of this is similar to what happened to David with the Philistines. He had to flee from Saul and lived there for a time until he could gain in strength. Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes, in marriage. The sister of Tahpenes bore him a son named Gunabath, whom Tahpenes brought up in the royal palace. There Gunabath lived with Pharaoh's own children. So this Edomite is taken in by the Egyptians. And that was a common practice in the ancient world. What do you do with kings that have been thrown out of power? Well, it might be to your advantage to take care of them, to honor them, to offer them sanctuary, because now you have this possible claimant to the throne in your power connection, someone who owes you, but also someone who could serve at your convenience as someone who could disrupt things in that land or cause problems, right? A good thing to have in your pocket. And we see here that they seem to be friends, they seem to get along, they have a close connection with each other. While he was in Egypt, Hadad heard that David rested with his fathers and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. Then Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go that I may return to my own country." Okay, so notice here, he wants to go back home to his own country because the great king of Israel is dead. David's no longer there. Joab is gone. Who then is going to protect him? Who's going to attack him? He feels safe in returning because the great generals are gone. And indeed, Solomon is going to be resting in his peaceful existence where he is, but will not take action. And Pharaoh says, "What have you lacked here that you want to go back to your own country?" Pharaoh asked. "Nothing," Hadad replied, "but do let me go." And God raised up against, so he goes to Edom. And then it says this really quickly, and God raised up against Solomon another adversary, Rezon, son of Eliah, who had fled from his master, Hadadezer, king of Zobah. You may remember the king of Zobah a while back, but this is somebody who's a rival to the throne of a kingdom in an Aramaic kingdom, which is in Syria. So this is to the north of Israel, and there was a king who had a rival there. And he gathered men around him and became the leader of a band of rebels when David destroyed the forces of Zobah. So he was rivaling, Zobah is defeated, but these rebels still remain. And they're now raiding, and it's similar to what David was doing, remember, during the time when Saul was after him. When David destroyed the forces of Zobah, the rebels went to Damascus where they settled and took control. So just as David took Jerusalem, these guys go to Damascus and take power there and are creating an army. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile toward Israel. So Edom and Aram, Syria, are both now hostile to Solomon, although we don't know how much action they're taking. We're going to see them take action after Solomon's gone. And now comes, those are two external enemies, and now we're going to hear about an internal foe. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Okay, so this guy is from one of the northern tribes, and we're going to learn that he was one of the people put in charge of the conscripted labor force, so Israelites who were forced to labor for the king. And as such, he had access to them, but apparently was unhappy with the way that was going. Here's the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the supporting terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David, his father. Remember, we talked about this a little bit before. The city of Jerusalem is built with two big ravines there, almost in a V shape in one side, and that's where the city of David was built. But some of that has little ridges there, and apparently during Solomon's time, terraces were established there to hold up the walls, to give greater stability, and to give attack spaces, but also to raise crops, make the place more attractive, to accomplish all kinds of things. So that's the way one of the things he did, and that was with conscripted labor. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing. When Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. So he was in charge of one group. The house of Joseph would be two tribes, Manasseh and Ephrathah, and I can never say that word. About this time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on his way wearing a new cloak. Okay, so Jeroboam's going out. He meets this prophet from Shiloh, and he's wearing new clothes. That's significant. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Okay, so Ahijah is making a symbolic act, and again, we're reminded of what Samuel did with his cloak, tearing it and giving it to David. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. So you're going to get the 10 tribes of the north. And these will eventually, of course, become the 10 lost tribes of Israel because of the destruction that will take place in the north, Israel, in 722 BC. So he is prophetically giving the kingdom to this young man. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe." So 10 and 1 doesn't quite work out. The implication is there's another tribe somewhere. The Levites could be argued that they're with both, so nobody gets them. That could be the case. You could argue that Benjamin is with both, although largely it seems to be in Judah. And also some people have suggested Simon has that kind of space. "I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonites, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Moloch, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws as David, Solomon's father, did." So the implication is because they've been unfaithful, this is taking place. "But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David, my servant, whom I chose, and who observed my commands and statutes." And again, a very stylized and incomplete picture of David's reign as compared to what we saw earlier, but they're going with the overall picture, I think. "I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give one tribe to his son so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name." So to honor David, his commitment, and the promises God made to him, there will still be a tribe that stays with him. "However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever." So the promise is that he can have a dynasty, but it is a conditional promise. You'll have as great a one as David if you do all these things. And of course we know the story very rapidly will degenerate, and they will not do all the things. They will not be faithful to God. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt to Shishak the king and stayed there until Solomon's death. Okay, so Egypt again plays a role in this. And interesting, I think, of Solomon married to the Pharaoh's daughter, but still his enemies are there. So you can see some of the sophisticated nuances of the relationships between kingdoms. And one more paragraph. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the Annals of Solomon? Now, we know nothing about this book. They're referencing it. Presumably, this is the record of his activities that Solomon kept in the royal palace. Apparently, it was available to some, and it was a different and secular account of all these things. We just have this reference to it, and we frequently get references like that in Kings and Chronicles. Then Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. And that's confusing because we have Rehoboam succeeding him, and of course his rival is Jeroboam. So Rehoboam and Jeroboam, but here's the picture. He lived a long, full life. He dies and is buried in the city of David. He is honored in death, even as in life. And now we come to the conclusion of Solomon's life. Now we're going to hear about how the kingdom divides next time. So we're going to stop there, but let's do a little reflection before we close this section and move to the New Testament. Solomon's a mixed bag, isn't he? In some ways, even more of a mixed bag than David. David had great sins, but he also seemed to be a great repenter. He did really seem to have his heart right with God. But what do we say about Solomon? Solomon is a person who's given a lot, has a lot, and yet seems to live like other kings. His devotion to the Lord is at best mixed. He seems to plant all the seeds for the destruction of the kingdom. He's regarded as wise, yet his wisdom doesn't seem to change the way he's living into a fruitful way. He seems vain. He seems caught up in signs of wealth and power, outward power, rather than really becoming a person who is building up the kingdom in positive ways. His use of forced labor, conscripted labor, it lays the seeds for the split in the kingdom, and clearly he leaves the kingdom, I think, weaker when he leaves it than when he found it. So even though we speak of the wisdom of Solomon, he's wise in the ways of the world, but not terribly wise in the ways of God. So we'll leave it there, I think, and we'll move on to James chapter 3. And now turning to James chapter 3, we've been hearing in James the importance of being consistent in your faith. He's talked in chapter 2 about not showing favoritism, that is, regarding people who were wealthy or held in high esteem by society as being of more importance than others in the church. He's also talked about how faith without works is dead. All of this has to do with living out your faith, making it whole, being consistent, growing in the faith. We call this sanctification, as we believe that when we become Christians, we're justified by God, we're put into a right relationship with Him, but that God's grace is continuing to work in our lives, changing and transforming us, fitting us for heaven, making our salvation real in all aspects of our lives. And I think that's what James is really writing here for us to do. He is saying, commit yourself to this, work at it, grow in it. And that's what we're going to see in the next section. He is going to talk about another area of our lives where we often show hypocrisy, and that is in our use of our tongues and of speech. Much of what he's going to say here in this section could be found in the world in general, but specifically we'll lift up some of those things as we get to them. But he is also going to be making this much more of putting it all into a religious context. He's not going to lift up Jesus Christ a lot here, but he is going to put it in a religious context, talking about God in general. So different from other parts of the New Testament, it doesn't emphasize Christ's work on the cross, but it does talk about our connection with God throughout this. So here we go. Chapter 3, verse 1. Not many of you should presume to be teachers, my brothers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. I've got to say that on all of James, that's probably my least favorite verse. And I'm saying that very selfishly because as a pastor, one of my jobs is to help get people to lead small groups and sometimes Sunday school classes. And it is hard work sometimes because people feel inadequate. And a verse like this almost intensifies that feeling of inadequacy as it warns us to be careful not to teach. And as somebody who jumped in when I was fairly young to teach and to lead, I know that there are mistakes you make along the way when you don't know stuff. Well, there's something Martin Luther said. He took Paul out of context and misquoted him and misapplied it, but I still think what he said was true. Paul said, "What then? Shall we sin boldly so that grace may abound?" No. But Martin Luther took it and said, "Sin boldly that grace may abound." And what he meant by that was, we can't live lives in fear of doing the wrong thing, so timidly that we don't advance the kingdom of God. There are opportunities around us, and we need to step forward and do our best for God and the kingdom, and trust that even though we're going to make mistakes, that God's grace is there working within us and around us, surrounding us in such a way that it will take our feeble efforts and make them into something better. I think teaching is a lot like that. I think teaching helps you grow and learn and move. And yes, you shouldn't do it arrogantly, you shouldn't do it lightly, you should do your best. But at the same time, boy, don't be afraid to go forward and teach. But he is warning, and he's warning them because of all the things that teaching can do that are bad. You have to be humble, you have to be careful, you have to research, you have to, learn. Okay, I hear that. Then he says this, we all stumble in many ways. Okay, all of us make mistakes. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. Now he's going to talk specifically about speech. And of course, speaking is something a teacher does. And I should have mentioned too, he says, when he talked about teaching, he said, because we who teach. It's the only place here he goes into the second person plural. We. He's recognizing himself as a teacher. But here it says, we all stumble in many ways. Okay? All of us are at fault. If anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man. So he's indicating speech is going to be one of those areas in which we fail. And he's going to lift up a lot of ways in which we fail in speech. I will tell you that he's already done that. He's already talked in chapter 1 and 2 about these things. The claim that temptations come from God, so misstatements about God are one way our tongue can fail us. In 2:36, he talked about the flattering greetings that people gave to the rich and the way they kind of snubbed the poor, so our speech was used inappropriately. In 2:16, he talked about careless speech, where we just wish well for the poor but don't do anything about it. In 2:18, he talked about superficial speech, where faith without works was dead, so it wasn't enough just to say things. And he's going to go on to talk about it in many other ways throughout this letter. But here he says, if you had perfect speech, you'd be able to keep your whole body in check. In other words, it's like a discipline that the tongue is almost the hardest thing to keep in mind. Now, that's an interesting way of putting it. I don't know that I would do that, put it quite that way. He is going to say very strong things about speech and how it often misleads us or leads us astray. It certainly reveals what's in our heart, but we also know that speech can sometimes create new realities. And we find this talked about in various ways. When I was a kid, we always heard from my parents when other kids said things that were mean about us, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt me. Okay, that's true, right? Words can't really inflict damage, yet they can. So likewise, if we ever said something mean about someone, my parents would berate us for, using our words inappropriately. Words do have a power. It's not absolute. They reveal, they create new realities, and we all know that sometimes just jumping in and saying, I'll do that, or I won't do that, creates a new reality for us. So here he's going to talk about how our speech can sometimes direct us and lead us, and how little things can sometimes exercise great power. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. And that's certainly an example of a little thing controlling a big thing. Specifically here, it ties into, the use of the mouth. Control the horse's mouth, you control everything about where it goes. And then he's going to give another one. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. And that's true too, isn't it? The rudder takes you where you want to go and can control so many things about a boat, even though it's huge. So a big horse is controlled by a little thing in its mouth. A big ship is controlled by a rudder, and he's saying our lives can control our bodies. Our tongues can control our bodies. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. So it can boast about how important it is or how significant. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. And again, that's a little thing that can have great power as it moves in the world. And our tongue can do that. And it almost, speaking it as maliciously, it can say something, and the next thing you know, you're getting into areas of trouble or difficulty. It reminds me of lies we tell. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive, and how they grow or take over. And boasts can do the same way. And so much of speech can shape our lives, often negatively. The tongue also is a fire, and he's going to speak of the tongue very negatively here, leaving out almost all the positive sides of our communication. And that's okay. I mean, we realize there's a corrective in other parts of the Bible about this. It's not an absolute truth, but we want to hear what he's saying about the tongue and its power to do evil. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. Now, everybody recognizes that as a very difficult phrase to translate. It's almost as though he's saying our speech is shaped by the world, and so when we use it, it takes us in a direction away from God. And boy, there's some truth to that. You know, just the ways and habits that we have of speaking that come to us from the world can sometimes shape us and take us in directions that are surprising. They put us in a thought world that isn't specifically Christian, and so it can lead us astray. And I hear that sometimes from people who, especially first new in the faith, they've heard an idea and it's a part of our speech, and the next thing you know, they're starting to go that way. Like, think of things like we say, like, when I come back in my next life, I'm going to be blah, blah, blah. And so they begin to think that way. Well, coming back in my next life, is that a part of our thinking and the way we are? Other phrases that just come in. So it's from the world, but think of also more generally or specifically, I guess would be a better way of putting it, of the way the world views things as being a part of our speech and how much that takes us perhaps away from the Lord. So he describes it as a world within this. And again, a hard phrase to translate, but it seems to be almost like the world is our tongue or language. The world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. The term there is actually Gehenna, the place right outside of Jerusalem where they burned trash, where babies were sacrificed in previous generations. It was metaphorically a place of destruction and a place where people were led astray. So evil, it sets the tongue on fire. The tongue leads the body in directions. And so he is suggesting that our tongues have great power to do evil and to lead us astray or to take us away from God. And that, of course, is true. He's going to lift up some examples of this elsewhere. But he also here now talks about the creative power of the tongue. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and creatures of the sea are being tamed and have been tamed by man. That's an interesting way of putting it. We can tame all kinds of things, right? And it takes us almost back to Genesis with its idea of creation and how all animals are brought into the presence of human beings so that we can control them. But no man can tame the tongue. It is restless evil full of deadly poison. Well, it is hard to control your speech, isn't it? And it is surprising how many times things come out of our mouths that are inappropriate or wrong. I'm likewise sometimes surprised by the good things that come out of my mouth, or how things are said better than I ever thought they could be by me. But it is true that sometimes we say mean things. I think they reveal really what's in our hearts and minds, but our tongues also shape our reality. Boy, I was thinking about this yesterday on two different incidences that happened. One, I was driving down Eagle Road making hospital visits, which I haven't been able to do in a while. I was driving by St. Luke's Meridian to go somewhere else, and someone had turned in to the turn lane, but had not done that very well at all. In fact, had done it horribly. So they had half their car at least blocking half my lane. And I'm driving in, and that's traffic's flying around like crazy there. I'm going 60 miles an hour, and then I have to brake. I'm trying to decide, can I go around them and stay enough in my lane to be safe? And I decide I can't. And then you're braking there, and you're going, wow, this is bad because there are all these cars behind me. And I so wanted to let this person know how unhappy I was with them, right? With my horn, with other actions. And then I'm thinking, well, they're turning into the hospital. This could easily be an older person who doesn't get out much, someone who's visiting someone who is ill. They could have some traumas going on in their life. So I kind of restrained myself, but I wasn't doing that very well. I was still angry, and I was worried about getting rear-ended. And this went on for minutes because the traffic light there is so long. And finally we got by, and as I went by, I couldn't help but kind of shake my fist at him. My words, and I said idiot under my breath. Now, those words shape my reality and shape my perspective on how I'm viewing things. They're also revealing what's inside my heart and life, but not in a positive or good way. How do our words shape us like that? The second one, I was just at the gym working out, and there were a bunch of young men there who, they always treat me nicely, but my gosh, they're foul-mouthed. They're just cussing away. And I guess it's a sign of how old I am, because when I was younger, that didn't bother me, but it bothers me now. And it annoys me, and they're loud. And yet they always treat me so nicely. If they get in my way or step in front of me, they're always polite. I guess because they think I'm super old or something. Anyhow, it's just interesting to see that. And why can't I get beyond that to something more important? I should be seeing them more as people that I should be, hey, I shouldn't be upset with them like that. They are who they are. I should try to meet them where they are and take them to this different place. Focus on what's really important. Anyhow, some thoughts about tongues. Now he's going to say the real problem with the tongue is that we're double-tongued. Now that's a funny phrase, but what he means by it is we use our tongues for completely different purposes that are in opposition to one another. And he's saying, just as he did earlier, there needs to be a consistency in what we do, how we treat people. We want to treat people the way God treats them, with love and respect. We want to not show favoritism. We want to be consistent in showing that our faith is real by living it out, not just speaking it out with our words. But now he's saying we need to be single-minded in our use of our tongues, and often we're not. This is what he says. With the tongue, we praise our Lord and Father. So we use it for good things. We give God praise. And with it, we curse men. Okay? Stupid under the breath. Who have been made in God's likeness. So he's saying those two things are in opposition to one another. And we need to be consistent. We need to have one of those things be true in our lives and not have both of them. And that's a problem for us, isn't it? Every time we're calling people idiots or looking at them, looking down on folks and saying that with our speech, wow, half the conversations on the internet are like this, with us speaking rashly and harshly against others. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. And he says brothers here, the phrase could be translated brothers and sisters. He's using brothers kind of generically, but it is a male term. This should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? Well, obviously that can't be true. So if you're a spring, what kind of spring are you? Are you a spring of God's praises, or are you a spring of curses against others? How are you speaking? All right. My brothers, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? So he's saying, if you're a grapevine, bear grapes. If you're God's child, give praise. Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. So he's just giving different analogies to help us understand that we need to be who we really are. And he sees our identity, our fundamental identity, which I hope is true for us and for you and me, that we are children of God, people in relationship with him. Now there's a section that we may review again next time, but it continues the same theme of being consistent, allowing God's power to change and transform you into the kind of person you are meant to be, called to be, and desire to be. He says this, who is wise and understanding among you? Well, that takes us back to the teachers, doesn't it? Who is wise? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. So if you're really wise, you're going to show it in your actions. And they are going to be actions performed in humility. And he's going to emphasize humility. In other words, an awareness of God's presence in your life and of our need for God. So it's not the braggart, I'm so great and wonderful. It's a recognition that we need the Lord in our lives and that we are not more important than others. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Bitter envy and selfish ambition. Why are those two lifted up as being significant? I think we tend not to downplay the importance and significance of envy, but so much of our lives and so much of what's negative in our lives is motivated by those two causes. In fact, advertising, which is very successful, or they wouldn't do it, is designed often to create envy within us. And we associate being with having. What do I mean by that? It's almost if I have things, I am somebody. Think of, the flagrant example, we think of kids in really poor areas, killing another kid in order to get their shoes. Because if I have those shoes, I'm somebody. But we do it in other ways, right? If I have this car, or this house, or these children, or this spouse, or these clothes, or have this gizmo, that will just be kind of cool. And I guess to an extent it's all right to have some of those, but if our motivation is envy, somebody else has it. If our motivation is that if I have this, I'm somebody, there's something significantly wrong in our lives. And ambition often leads us to fight others. It moves from a vision of scarcity in the world. They have this, and so they're different from me, and I want it. I want to have it so that I'm better than them, more important than them. Do not boast about those things or deny the truth. Be truthful, be consistent, be regular. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. So he's again contrasting, as he does throughout this letter, in this dualistic way, things of this world and things of God. So to desire things in a way that does you spiritual harm and others spiritual harm is envy. And that's something that comes from this world. It's a part of how people think in this society. It's a part of what they are motivated by. Such things do not come from heaven. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. So envy and ambition lead to evil actions and violence, right? Don't they? Look around. It's so interesting to just see how much of our lives are ruled by these two forces. And we confuse being with having. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Wow, a lot of positive things that are being said there. It's pure. That means it's not diluted. So we're supposed to be pure in our motivations, in our wisdom. Peace-loving, striving to create good relationships. Considerate, thinking of others. Submissive, not asserting our own rights first. Full of mercy, ready to forgive and to look the other way and to look beyond. Good fruit, full of mercy and good fruit, making blessings in the world. Impartial, so it's not based on our biases. And sincere. And then he says, peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. So if people are really sincere in this, really working to have this, they're planting seeds that will produce good relations amongst people and between us and God. So that's the goal. We're going to stop there, but this is really a part of what's going to happen next, where he's going to continue to talk about being consistent in our faith walk, right? And growing in that. Well, interesting to hear how Solomon was unable to be consistent, and yet this passage is all about consistency in our faith. Solomon was given all these great gifts and yet unable to bring them to fruition. We who maybe have less gifts can do more if we really commit ourselves to God and to his service. So let's close with a word of prayer. Holy God, we pray for your blessing as we study your word, that it might speak to us and help us to grow. May we become more consistent followers of your word, allowing your spirit to change and transform us as we receive from that spirit the wisdom that comes from above. Amen.